But yeah, so we've been kind of talking about like negative self-talk. And I know you've talked a little bit about self-compassion, but I'm curious about like your work and research and things that you've learned throughout this process of really learning about self-compassion.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey. So an area that I nerd out with in research is also psychometrics or measurement. And um, so the way when we measure something like depression, we might say, oh, I created these items and they reflect depression, but how do we actually know that they did? Or here's a measure of depression and anxiety. Well, how do we know that these are two different constructs being measured? And what's cool is that there are ways you could test that to also then test the theory underlying the construct, like depression and anxiety are two different things. You can test that based on how people respond to those items. So with self-compassion, my work has been that intersection of measurement and theory. So really understanding what is self-compassion, what's the structure of self-compassion, and then how does that relate to different aspects of mental health. And so part of my beginning into self-compassion was looking at the self-compassion scale, which is the most widely used measure of self-compassion. And that was introduced by Dr. Kristen Neff in 2003. It was published. And she has a lot of expertise around self-compassion and Buddhism. And so she did this remarkable thing of bringing over that Eastern wisdom to the Western world. And like I said earlier, the way that like our understanding of statistics and psychology and the intersection of those things have evolved a lot. And so the way that scale was created, the methods could have been better. And you could say the same thing about some of the work I've done. And I'm sure, gosh, 20 years from now, who knows what I'm going to think about the work I published, right? And so what I've learned, and there still continues to be debate over really what self-compassion is. This is the most prominent perspective currently, is that there are these 6 areas of self-compassion. So there are these kind of 3 self-warmth or the positive self-compassion parts, and they each have like a counterpart. So the first one that comes to mind for most of us is self-kindness. So being kind in the face of failure or inadequacy to ourselves. And then the opposite counterpart is self-judgment, being judgmental towards ourselves. And then other pieces that are less intuitive to Western philosophy, which is why it's so great that Dr. Neff did this work, is common humanity. So this idea that we're not the only ones suffering in our pain. Other people experience this. And so the opposite of that, I'm like blanking on
Would
the
be
name, which is
like, oh yeah, but I was just gonna
go
say
for it.
it's like when you think that like
Isolation.
nobody understands this pain. Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Isolation. That's yep, exactly.
yeah.
So no one understands me. I'm the only one going through this. And then the third one is mindfulness. And the mindfulness itself is also a really interesting, multifaceted construct. Dr. Neff's conceptualization of mindfulness within this context is less about connection to your internal experience and more about mindfulness with your environment around you. So, and connecting with everything also happening outside of your body, whereas over identification, where it's like your pain is the center of what's happening for you. And so those 3 components are really central to self-compassion. And so what happened was Dr. Neff created this scale and came up with, which is really common, like these reverse score, the intention of these items being reverse scored of self-judgment, isolation, and over-identification. But through this thing called factor analysis, she found that those positive and negative components were separate, which is also fits with different psychological theories like bivariate plane theory, this idea that just like you can be happy and sad at the same time, or you can not be happy, but it doesn't mean you're sad, right? And so this idea that positive and negative don't necessarily happen on like a unidimensional continuum. But because of how some things were carried out methodologically, again, different time, it was kind of purported that, okay, there are these like 6 different areas and they all go into this one self-compassion score. So you take those items, you just reverse score them, it's fine. You make this one self-compassion measure. But like I said, happiness and sadness are not on a continuum. And so we did some work with the scale, and what we're finding, and there's a debate, and if Dr. Neff listens to this podcast, I'm sure she won't agree with me, and that's fine because that's part of the process of research, and um, that there are these 2 factors. So those 3 positive things go to the self-compassion factor, and these other 3 things go to a self-coldness factor. It's also been called, there have been uncompassion, I think it's been uncompassionate self-responding and self-compassionate responding. They've been called different things. Part of why it's important to, so that's part of what my research has showed, is that these are 2 different things, that they coexist and they operate, they do a bit of a dance with each other, but they are different. And why that matters is because the research that's looked at the relationship of self-compassion with these different outcomes, the score might not be quite accurate because half the items are something different. And so what I found in one study, or a couple of studies for my dissertation, for example, was that when you put self-compassion and self-coldness as predictors of well-being and distress, so you control for the impact that each other have on each outcome, that self-compassion's relationship with distress becomes non-significant, but they both are directly related to well-being. But interestingly, or I think is interesting, we found what's called an interaction effect. So that self-compassion, although it didn't hold statistical significance over and above self-coldness directly in the relationship with distress, its impact was on how strongly self-coldness relates to distress. So those who reported higher self-compassion, the relationship between self-coldness and distress was much weaker. And so that points to the importance of self-compassion as an intervention point. So when you ask, well, what do you do in the face of being self-critical, then being self-compassionate is still going to be important. And the idea is that it could be really hard to reduce self-coldness. Like we've been talking about for a lot of this conversation, these are things that are ingrained in us from an early age. So if we were to say, okay, we're going to decrease your being judgmental on yourself, like I can't do that in 3 sessions. Are you kidding me? But I can help clients and give them some self-compassionate intervention skills while we work more long-term on unpacking and dismantling the pieces underlying that self-coldness. But what's also cool is that because that for people who might be in a place of, okay, I'm not distressed, but I want to cultivate more fulfillment in my life, then the focus doesn't have to be on self-compassion as an interruption of the self-coldness. It's that direct relationship held up. So that's some of the work that I found with self-compassion, is how do we measure it and what is it theoretically, and then how does it relate to these different constructs, and that it's just been a little bit different, or research is pointing that it's a little bit different than maybe what we originally thought, but the central message that self-compassion is so important, that is still strongly supported.
Yeah, I think it stands to logic too that it would be much more dynamic of a process than, right? Like, and I think that's always like such a good way of making an initial, judgment of a hypothesis, is like, logically, does this hold true? Like when we think about it, and it's like, yeah, like everything, as you were just explaining that, like as the was it self-compassion or self-kindness, one of them, and then it disassociates the severity of the other 2, like
Yep.
that does kind of make sense logically, that when like the way you perceive things and the way you see the world in, like when it comes to like these different things, is going to be so variable, right? Like, so just to think that we could just put this on a single x-axis of like, and number it and just put you on the continuum does seem kind of silly. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And another piece too is that people can be both self-critical and self-compassionate, right? Like, and it might seem counterintuitive, but you have those people who really do care about themselves and they'll do the different exercises and they're like, okay, I'm not the only person that's suffering. But then at the same time, they might be really hard on themselves and be high achievers. And if those both can coexist, then we know that it's, more intricate. And there also might
Yeah.
be some people who are like, I'm neither of those. I just exist in the world, and I sometimes envy those people, but